Fined $3,000 for daring to present evidence of her innocence. Jasmine Crockett stayed silent. But just seconds later, she played a video that led the FBI to handcuff the judge in the middle of the courtroom. The press exploded. The entire system shook. She said only one thing: the truth can't be bought. But has justice truly been restored? Or is this just the tip of the iceberg? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courtroom hadn't opened yet, but for Jasmine Crockett, the war had already begun. Before sunrise, Jasmine woke with purpose. No hesitation, no doubt. Her DC apartment was silent, lit only by the glow over a table stacked with legal briefs and marked-up rulings. Today, she wasn't just defending herself. She was standing up to a machine built to silence people like her. She tied her curls back, slipped into her blazer, and stared into the mirror. "They want to erase me," she said, steady and low. "Not today." The city outside was still asleep, but Jasmine Crockett was wide awake and ready for war. Just days earlier, billionaire media titan Veronica Langley had filed a $15 million lawsuit accusing Jasmine of defamation for stating publicly, "Tax dollars shouldn't fund extremist programming." No names were mentioned, but Langley made it personal because it was her empire Jasmine had rattled. And now she was using the courts to finish what outrage culture had started. Jasmine wasn't surprised. Langley was powerful, connected, and ruthless. She owned newsrooms, funded campaigns, and had 4 senators on speed dial. The judge, James Boasberg, a name that rang alarms. His rulings had always leaned one way, and Jasmine knew exactly which way that was. But she wasn't walking into that courtroom to apologize. She wasn't there to play defense. She was there to fight, alone if she had to, with nothing but the truth in her hand and a recording no one saw coming. She stepped into the courtroom, and the air changed instantly. No warm welcomes, no formal neutrality, just a heavy silence layered with judgment. Jasmine Crockett walked with calm, but every eye in the room followed her like she didn't belong there. As she approached the defense table alone, no legal team, no advisors, Veronica Langley turned slowly from her plush leather chair at the plaintiff's bench. Her eyes swept over Jasmine's simple navy suit and worn briefcase. A smirk curled on her lips. "No lawyer?" she said dryly, not even bothering to lower her voice. "This might be quicker than I thought," her attorney chuckled under his breath. "Hope she brought a pen. She'll need one to sign the settlement papers." Jasmine sat without flinching. She placed her files neatly on the table, hands steady. She had heard worse in back rooms and press briefings and late-night threats and TV smear campaigns. This wasn't new, but what was new was how open the hostility was today. Judge James Boasberg entered seconds later, his robe billowing slightly as he took the bench. He didn't look at the room. He looked only at her. The corners of his mouth curled downward, like he had already made his decision. "Well, well," he said, voice cool but laced with bite. "Ms. Crockett, representing herself, I see. Bold move, or maybe just naive." His tone dripped with mockery. "Let's hope you know more about law than slogans." The courtroom didn't gasp. It was too used to this kind of power play. But the gallery shifted. A few interns raised their eyebrows. A court reporter paused her typing. Boasberg continued, leaning forward, elbows on the bench like a man preparing to grill. "I'll say this once," he said firmly. "This is a court of law, not a press room, not a political theater. If you plan to turn this into some viral circus, I'll shut it down fast. Understood?" Jasmine met his gaze squarely. "Understood, Your Honor," she replied, even and controlled. Her voice didn't crack. It didn't rise. But under that quiet tone was something steel-hard, a tension even Boasberg noticed, but pretended not to. He glanced at Langley's team and nodded with faint approval. "Plaintiff, your witness list is in order. Your exhibits pre-approved. I assume we'll move swiftly today." Then his gaze snapped back to Jasmine. "Defense, I expect no procedural antics. If you're unprepared, say so now. I won't have this court's time wasted on amateur hour." Jasmine didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly opened her binder, revealing numbered tabs, printed precedents, and court transcripts. Everything organized, Everything ready. I came here to defend myself, Your Honor, she said clearly, and I'm fully prepared to do so. No theatrics, just facts. Boasberg raised an eyebrow. We'll see, he muttered almost dismissively. But I've seen confidence from self-represented defendants before. Usually lasts until cross-examination. A low chuckle came from Langley's corner. Jasmine heard it, ignored it. Her pulse was steady, but deep inside she knew exactly what this was. Not just a trial, but a performance, with the script already written and her role cast as the loser. The difference was, she didn't follow scripts, and she had a twist ending none of them saw coming. And then the assault began, not with shouting, but with precision. Judge Boasberg gave a curt nod. Mr. Feldman, proceed. The room stilled. Cyrus Feldman rose slowly, like a lion stretching before the kill. His suit was dark, sharp, expensive. Everything about him was deliberate, from the silk pocket square to the slight pause before he spoke. Your Honor, he began, his voice like polished steel, we are here today because of a calculated statement, one that did real measurable damage. This isn't about opinion. This is about destruction. He turned toward the gallery as if addressing an audience far beyond the courtroom. My client, Ms. Veronica Langley, has spent over 2 decades building a media network that provides diverse voices a platform, sometimes progressive, sometimes provocative, but always protected under the First Amendment. Until that protection was weaponized against her. He snapped open a file and held it up. Exhibit A, viewership dropped by 22.7% within 72 hours of Ms. Crockett's statement being aired nationwide. He dropped it on the table with a thud. Exhibit B, 3 major advertisers, Heron Tech, Madison Bank, and Beacon Brands, pulled out, citing public concern, fear of backlash, brand misalignment. Their words, not ours. Feldman paced slowly, each step echoing. Now, Ms. Crockett would have you believe this was just a generic policy comment, something harmless, vague, theoretical. He stopped, looking directly at Jasmine. But let's be clear, she's no amateur. She's an attorney, a former civil rights litigator. She knows the power of language better than anyone in this room. His voice tightened. She stood in front of a national audience and said, tax dollars shouldn't fund extremist programming. She didn't name Langley. She didn't have to. The public connected the dots. That's how smear campaigns work. Implication over identification. He gestured toward the projector. A series of images flickered onto the courtroom screen. Charts showing viewership collapse, highlighted tweets calling Langley a fraud, leaked emails from ad execs expressing panic. Then came screenshots from YouTube, with Jasmine's quote repeated under bold red headlines. She called them extremists. Langley's empire under fire. One video had over 4 million views, another over 10,000 angry comments. She set the spark, Feldman said, pointing to the screen. The internet did the rest, but she lit the match. He turned back to the bench, dropping the tone of performance for one of cold accusation. The defense may try to argue this was opinion, but the law is clear. When someone in a position of authority speaks recklessly, knowing it can cause reputational harm, it crosses the line into defamation, especially when the target is identifiable, even if unnamed. He picked up a document, contractual loss statements, initialed by executives. The damages aren't hypothetical, Your Honor. They're on paper. They've already happened, and Ms. Langley is owed justice. Jasmine remained perfectly still. She didn't fidget, didn't blink, but every blow Feldman delivered was designed to make her appear smaller, outmatched, like a reckless lone wolf who'd barked too loud and now couldn't take the heat. Across the room, Langley sat like royalty. Perfect posture, expensive pearl earrings, that same smug expression. This wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a public shaming, and Jasmine knew it. As Cyrus Feldman returned to his seat, radiating confidence, the courtroom shifted its gaze to her. Judge Boasberg leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen like he was already bored. Defense, he said flatly, if you have a response, make it quick. Jasmine stood slowly, spine straight, eyes calm but unyielding. The weight of the room pressed down, but she wore it like armor. "Your Honor," she began, voice clear and steady, "this case is built on smoke and spin, but the law is built on precedent. And the precedent is crystal clear." She held up a single sheet of paper. New York Times versus Sullivan, 1964, a cornerstone of First Amendment protection. In that decision, the Supreme Court ruled that public officials, and by extension, public figures, cannot claim defamation unless they prove actual malice. She stepped forward, pacing slowly, deliberately. Actual malice means that the speaker either knowingly lied or acted with reckless disregard for the truth. That's the standard. Not hurt feelings, not public reaction, and certainly not business losses tied to someone else's interpretation of a general remark. Her tone sharpened, eyes locking on Feldman. "My statement didn't name Ms. Langley. It didn't name her company. It didn't call out a specific show, host, or platform. It was a broader comment on public spending, on taxpayer responsibility, a policy opinion." She turned back to Boasberg. "And political speech, especially from public officials, is the most protected form of speech under our Constitution. That's not just legal theory. That's the law." Boasberg's lips twisted slightly, unimpressed. "Are you lecturing the bench now, Ms. Crockett?" he asked, a faint sneer forming. A few people in the gallery chuckled. Jasmine didn't even blink. "I'm citing binding precedent, Your Honor," she replied, measured but firm. "And if this courtroom values the Constitution as much as it claims to, then the First Amendment isn't up for negotiation." Feldman raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Langley leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, visibly irritated. Jasmine pressed on. "If this court allows vague public reaction to override legal standards, then you're not just punishing me. You're setting a dangerous precedent that chills speech for every official in this country." But Jasmine wasn't done. Not when the truth was sitting right in front of her. After citing New York Times versus Sullivan and laying the foundation of constitutional protection, she took a slow breath, then reached into her binder. The courtroom watched as she pulled out a crisp, clearly labeled document, the official transcript from the press briefing in question. "Your Honor," she said, walking calmly to the evidence table, "this is the complete certified transcript of my statement, recorded by the Office of White House Communications. Every word, every sentence, no edits, no omissions." She held it up, her voice steady but ringing with quiet urgency. "It shows in black and white that I never mentioned any individual, any program, any network, or any company, certainly not Miss Langley or her platforms. This case is built on an interpretation. This document is built on fact." She placed it down gently, as if laying the first stone of a foundation. "This transcript doesn't just support my position, it demolishes the plaintiff's narrative. Their entire case depends on the idea that my words were targeted and malicious. This proves they weren't." She took a step back, hands clasped in front of her, giving the court space to process. A long beat passed. Boasberg stared at the document, then at Jasmine, lips curling slightly as if she'd just spilled coffee on his desk. Then came the blow. "This document," he said slowly, "is irrelevant." His gavel didn't come down, but his voice cracked like a whip. "You are not here to argue over a transcript, Ms. Crockett. You are here because your statement created impact. This court is concerned with consequences, not your intentions." The silence was sharp. Even Cyrus Feldman blinked, surprised by how quickly the judge dismissed it. Jasmine stood still, as if frozen for a moment, her eyes fixed on Boasberg. "With respect, Your Honor," she said carefully, "the plaintiff's case hinges on the content of my statement, not on reaction. If we don't examine the actual words I said, how can this court assess whether harm was even possible?" Her tone was measured, almost pleading, but not out of weakness. It was logic battling against the impossible. Boasberg leaned forward, eyes narrowing like a man who'd already made up his mind before stepping into the courtroom. "Ms. Crockett, this is not a philosophy seminar. This is a courtroom, and I will not allow this proceeding to be derailed by grandstanding over paperwork." Jasmine didn't break eye contact. "This isn't paperwork," she replied evenly. "It's the truth. You're dismissing proof that directly refutes their claim, and you haven't even read it." The judge slammed his gavel once, loud enough to jolt the room. "That's enough. If you want to make speeches, try your luck on cable news. Here you answer to the law, and I decide what matters." The threat landed with full weight. The gallery tensed. One reporter's fingers hovered above their laptop keyboard. A clerk glanced up, clearly unsettled. Everyone could feel it. Something was wrong. Jasmine stepped back, not retreating, but recalibrating. "Then I respectfully ask the court to acknowledge that it is choosing to ignore exculpatory evidence." Her voice was low now, not raised but powerful in its restraint. "I entered this courtroom with respect for the process. I'm not asking for favors. I'm asking for fairness. If the truth can't be reviewed in this room, then what exactly are we all doing here?" Judge Boasberg's face twitched. For a split second, something flickered. Discomfort, maybe even embarrassment. Then it was gone, replaced by cold, stony rage. He leaned forward, knuckles pressed into the bench, eyes hard as glass. "You are dangerously close to contempt, Miss Crockett." Jasmine didn't flinch. "I'm not disrespecting this court," she said evenly. "I'm defending myself with facts, with evidence that directly rebuts a multi-million-dollar defamation claim. That's not defiance. That's due process." A hush fell over the room. Every head turned toward the bench. What would the judge do? Address the merit of her words, or punish her for daring to speak them? Boasberg didn't hesitate. He slammed the gavel down, once, twice, 3 times, the sound sharp and violent. $3,000, he snapped. "Contempt of court, effective immediately." The words came out not like a ruling, but like a strike. No hearing, no warning, no legal basis cited. Just raw authority, weaponized in full view of everyone. "This is my courtroom," he said, voice rising. "Not a platform for speeches, not a political rally, and not a soapbox for someone trying to make headlines. If you can't follow the rules, Miss Crockett, you can leave." Jasmine stood frozen, but not from fear. Her jaw clenched, her eyes locked on him, with a stare that didn't beg for mercy. It held him accountable. Her hands, still holding the transcript, didn't move. She could have exploded. She could have shouted. But she didn't. That silence said more than words ever could. "You're abusing this bench, and we both know it." The courtroom was suffocatingly still. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, too stunned to type. One reporter leaned toward another and whispered, just loud enough for the rows behind to hear, "He's trying to bury her, no matter what it takes." Another voice added, "He didn't even read the transcript." The courtroom was frozen in silence. Jasmine didn't argue. She didn't plead. She just breathed, one slow, steady breath, then moved with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. She reached into her briefcase and retrieved a small black USB drive, unmarked, simple. The kind of object no one notices, until it detonates everything. She walked calmly to the side table where the courtroom projector was connected, inserted the drive into the terminal, and typed a command. The monitor blinked to life. Judge Boasberg raised an eyebrow. "What do you think you're doing, Ms. Crockett?" he snapped. "This court has not approved." Jasmine interrupted him, not with words but with the screen. It began in grainy black and white. A security camera feed, time-stamped 3 weeks ago. Location, Garage B3, private access, East Side Towers. The footage was silent, but every person in the room leaned forward instinctively. The setting was unmistakably real. A dimly lit underground parking lot with concrete beams, security mirrors, and fluorescent bulbs buzzing faintly overhead. Then came movement. From the left side of the screen, Judge James Boasberg walked into frame. He wasn't wearing his robe. He wasn't in court. He wore a dark trench coat, collar up, face cautious. He looked around briefly, then stepped toward a shadowed corner near the far wall. A man approached, taller, younger, dressed in a sleek charcoal suit. He carried something small in his hand, a white envelope, fat with contents. No words were exchanged. The camera angle caught everything. The envelope was passed. Boasberg took it, paused, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. And then he spoke. Crystal clear audio synced in, his voice unmistakable. "Tell her not to worry. This one will be wrapped up quick." Then came the handshake, 2 seconds long, firm, familiar, and the screen froze. Jasmine turned slowly to face the bench. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "This is your judge," she said evenly. "That was your parking garage. And that," she pointed toward the frozen image of Boasberg pocketing the envelope, "is your justice system." You could hear a pin drop. A single bead of sweat ran down the judge's temple. He opened his mouth, desperate to speak, to reassert control, but no words came. "Just breathe." Then he snapped. "Turn that off!" Boasberg shouted, banging his gavel so hard it echoed off the marble walls. "This is illegal. This is a violation of federal courtroom." His voice cracked, halfway between rage and panic. "That footage is inadmissible, and anyone who uses it will face charges." And then the courtroom erupted. It wasn't noise in the traditional sense. It was something deeper. The sound of an entire room unspooling at the seams. Gasps shot through the gallery like electricity. Phones flew up. Cameras began flashing with the urgency of history being made. Reporters leapt from their seats. Someone dropped their coffee, and the splash on the tile echoed like a gunshot. Every person in that room knew something irreversible had just happened. Jasmine didn't move. She stood still as stone, the giant projection behind her frozen on the image of Judge Boasberg, clutching the white envelope. That's when the FBI agent made his move. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark navy suit stepped forward from the back of the courtroom. His stride was exact, purposeful, lethal. No hesitation, no drama, just the precision of someone executing a federal warrant. With a flick of his wrist, he produced his badge and held it high, speaking above the chaos in a voice that instantly commanded the room. "Judge James Boasberg, by order of the United States Department of Justice, you are under arrest for accepting bribes and violating the Federal Judicial Integrity Act." His words fell like thunder, clear, unshakable. Not a suggestion, a sentence. Boasberg, still frozen behind the bench, blinked twice as if the reality hadn't fully landed. Then his lips parted. "What? What are you talking about? That video, it's manipulated. This is political theater." His voice cracked. The robe that once cloaked him in authority now looked oversized, like a costume worn too long. He backed up a step, eyes darting to the clerk, then to Feldman, then to Langley. No one moved. No one helped. The agent stepped closer, his partner flanking the side. "Sir, you are instructed to step away from the bench immediately. If you resist, we will be forced to detain you with force." There was no room for interpretation. This wasn't a hearing. This was a reckoning. Boasberg's voice turned shrill. "You can't do this. I'm a sitting federal judge. I am protected under—" Click. The sound of handcuffs snapping shut was unmistakable. One agent had already come behind him, gripping his wrists and locking the cuffs tight. Boasberg flinched as the cold steel dug into his skin. His face twisted, not in pain, but in disbelief. The kind of disbelief that only comes when a man who thought he was untouchable suddenly isn't. In the gallery, phones were held high. Reporters were whispering frantically into microphones. A live stream was already running on 3 national networks. Cameras captured every second. Boasberg being pulled from the bench, his robe flaring slightly, his face pale and slick with sweat. History wasn't waiting for the evening news. It was happening live. And then all eyes turned to Langley. She hadn't moved. Not when the video played. Not when the arrest was announced. Not when her hand-picked judge was dragged from his throne. Now she sat stiff in her chair, back ramrod straight, skin drained of color. Her breathing was shallow. Her lips parted once, but no sound came. Even Feldman had taken a step back from her, as if instinctively distancing himself from a sinking ship. She glanced at Jasmine for the first time in the entire trial, not with arrogance or contempt, but with something far closer to fear. Jasmine held her gaze for only a second. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Instead, she turned back to face the courtroom, calm, resolute, centered in a moment that had been built brick by brick from the injustice she'd been forced to endure. And when she finally spoke, the words didn't rise above the chaos. They cut right through it. "The truth," she said softly, "is the only thing money can't buy." And this time, the silence wasn't shock. It was respect. It was the sound of power shifting. of a courtroom remembering what justice was supposed to feel like. And for the first time that day, no one dared speak over her. The echoes of the gavel had barely faded, and already the courthouse was in freefall. The courtroom, once the arena of calculated arguments and veiled threats, now felt like ground zero. People were standing, murmuring, some openly staring in disbelief at the empty bench where Judge Boasberg had just been seated minutes earlier before being led away in handcuffs. The clerk tried to maintain decorum, but the illusion of control had collapsed. The bailiff's voice cracked through the noise. This session is now in recess until further notice. No one questioned it. The law had just turned on itself. Veronica Langley and Cyrus Feldman didn't make a statement. They didn't hold their heads high. They didn't even protest. They simply slipped away through the side consultation chamber, shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, like architects of a failed coup. No cameras followed. No reporters chased them. The media didn't need their side anymore. The story had moved on. Jasmine Crockett had just turned a legal proceeding into a national reckoning. Outside, the air was electric. The scene in front of the federal courthouse of the District of Columbia was unlike anything the city had seen in years. News trucks lined the block, satellite dishes spinning, generators humming. Anchors stood on boxes, adjusting earpieces and shouting into cameras. Live feeds from all major networks flooded the airwaves. The hashtags had already gone viral. Boasberg arrested, Langley Gate, justice served, and Crockett storm. Twitter was melting. TikTok clips of Boasberg's arrest hit 1 million views before his booking photo even cleared the system, and in the middle of it all, one moment rose above the digital noise. Not through a phone, but through a voice. A local news crew was doing man-on-the-street interviews when they turned their mic toward a man standing quietly near the courthouse steps. He wasn't holding a sign. He wasn't shouting, just watching. His name was Walter Branson, a 70-year-old Vietnam War veteran, wearing a fraying field jacket, a U.S. Marines baseball cap, and a row of campaign ribbons that hadn't been touched in years. At first, the reporter treated him like any other interview, standard filler. But Walter didn't give them filler. He gave them the truth. "I've watched D.C. eat its own for 5 decades, he said, eyes never leaving the courthouse entrance. And I've seen cowards in nice suits let good people get torn apart because they were scared of losing power." He paused. The reporter leaned in. "But that girl, Jasmine Crockett, she walked straight into the lion's den and pulled the teeth right out of its mouth. No notes, no bodyguards, just the truth." His hand trembled slightly, but his voice didn't. "She did what 100 senators didn't. She didn't wait for someone else to fix it. She stood up. Alone." The camera panned in. Walter adjusted his hat and looked straight into the lens. "You want to know what courage looks like? It ain't a flag, it ain't a speech. It's a black woman with a USB drive and the guts to call out a crooked judge to his face. That's what America was supposed to be. And I'm damn proud to be alive to see it." The video aired live. Within 10 minutes, it was clipped, subtitled, and shared by millions. Walter Branson for president began trending. People were crying in comment sections. A former Supreme Court clerk tweeted, "That man just said more truth in 60 seconds than I've heard in the last 10 years of hearings." Inside the courthouse, Jasmine sat alone at the defense table, the room slowly emptying around her. Her hands were still on the table, one resting on the transcript Boasberg had refused to read, the other on the USB drive that had detonated a scandal. Her eyes weren't on the reporters or the cameras. They were on the seal of the court carved into the wall across from her. For the first time since the trial began, she allowed herself to exhale. She hadn't just won a motion. She had shifted the balance of power, and the country had noticed. Because what happened that day wasn't just about one corrupt judge or one media titan. It was about something deeper. It was about a woman, once dismissed, mocked, fined, and ignored, who stood up not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told their truth didn't matter. And by the time the sun began to set over Washington, D.C., America wasn't asking, "Who is Jasmine Crockett?" anymore. It was asking, "Where do we go now that she's shown us the truth?" The fallout from Boasberg's arrest hadn't even settled into memory before a new figure entered the courtroom. And with her came an entirely different kind of gravity. Judge Margaret Ellis was no stranger to high-profile cases or public scrutiny. A former federal prosecutor and the first woman appointed to the D.C. Circuit from a nonpartisan recommendation panel, she had built her reputation not on theatrics or ideology, but on a singular, unshakable quality: integrity. When she entered the courtroom, she didn't need to announce order. Her very presence imposed it. The gallery quieted. The media lowered their voices. Even Langley's legal team sat straighter. Ellis glanced at the case file, then looked directly at Jasmine. This court will proceed under the standards of due process, impartiality, and federal law, she said, her voice calm and commanding. The defense may now present all evidence previously blocked or suppressed. For Jasmine Crockett, it was the moment she'd bled for. She stood slowly. No dramatic flair, no grandstanding, just a woman carrying the weight of weeks of legal sabotage and public humiliation. But in her eyes burned something new: vindication within reach. Her first act was simple, but devastating. She walked to the center of the courtroom and laid out a thick folder of previously dismissed documents. The full time-stamped transcript of her press briefing, signed affidavits from 3 nonpartisan communication staffers who had been present, and the official media log confirming that no specific individual, network, or organization was named or targeted. Not once, not even indirectly. This transcript, she said clearly, was refused by the previous presiding judge. But today I ask the court to consider what it plainly shows: that the plaintiff's central claim is not only unsubstantiated, but demonstrably false. Judge Ellis reviewed the top pages, then nodded. "It will be entered into the record. Please continue." And Jasmine did. She called her first witness, a senior communications analyst from the Office of Government Ethics. Under oath, the analyst confirmed that Jasmine's comments were consistent with ongoing budget discussions inside the White House, statements regarding public funding of entertainment content, not personal attacks. Jasmine then introduced audience data, ratings trends, and advertising revenue trajectories from Langley's media holdings, showing a steady decline in numbers months before her press conference. Every point Feldman tried to raise in rebuttal, every angle, every twist, every narrative reshaping, was met with a direct citation of federal case law. Jasmine invoked New York Times versus Sullivan to dismantle the argument of reputational harm, Falwell versus Flint to reinforce protections for public discourse, and Milkovich versus Lorraine Journal Company to clarify the distinction between opinion and actionable defamation. At one point, Feldman pivoted, visibly sweating, trying to frame Jasmine's remarks as part of a coordinated political smear, reading from a handful of outraged tweets and email excerpts from Langley's advertisers. Jasmine didn't blink. "Those tweets," she said calmly, "are from members of the public reacting to their interpretation of my words, not the words themselves. Reactions do not establish malice. The First Amendment does not shield you from discomfort. It shields the speaker from punishment for making uncomfortable truths known." She then walked to the evidence screen and clicked through side-by-side comparisons of her speech and the statements misrepresented in Langley's lawsuit. The contrast was brutal. In one column, carefully worded commentary about federal spending on media. In the other, a media narrative that had been spun into outrage by headlines, not by Jasmine. By the third hour of testimony, Judge Ellis had begun taking notes by hand. The courtroom was hanging on every word, not just for drama, but because the truth was finally breathing again. One journalist whispered, "She's teaching a masterclass." The court clerk, who had flinched under Boasberg's rulings days earlier, now typed with steady hands. Even some of the jury consultants from Langley's side were exchanging nervous glances. Feldman made one last effort, a desperate plea to emotion. He spoke about the irreversible damage to Langley's legacy, the stress she'd endured, the advertisers who pulled out. "No amount of legal parsing," he said, "can undo the very real financial pain caused by Ms. Crockett's words." Jasmine didn't interrupt. She waited, then walked slowly to the front of the room and said, clearly, coldly, truthfully, "Pain is not proof. Feeling offended is not the same as being defamed. If it were, every honest conversation in America would end in a lawsuit. We are not here to protect egos. We are here to protect rights. The plaintiff may be wealthy, she may be powerful, but what she is not is entitled to rewrite the Constitution because she didn't like how it felt to be challenged." And in that moment, something changed. Judge Ellis set down her pen. The room was silent again, not out of fear, but out of awe. Because Jasmine Crockett had walked through fire, and now she stood unburned. The courtroom was no longer a trap. It had become a mirror, and it was finally reflecting the truth. It began with silence. Not the kind that creeps in when people don't know what to say, but the kind that follows something seismic. The kind that hangs in the air after a building has just withstood a quake. Judge Margaret Ellis reviewed her notes one final time. Her pen rested gently on the leather folder before her, the gavel untouched for the moment. Then she looked up, eyes scanning the courtroom with sharp, even clarity. Her gaze landed on Jasmine Crockett, who stood poised, unflinching, hands resting lightly on a folder of now validated truth. Judge Ellis spoke, her voice measured and deliberate. In this courtroom, the law must remain sovereign, not money, not status, and not emotion. She paused. After thorough review of the evidence presented, transcripts, expert testimony, verified witness statements, and relevant federal precedent, it is the ruling of this court that the defendant, Ms. Jasmine Crockett, did not engage in defamation. Her comments were political in nature and made within the scope of her role as a public communicator. As such, they are protected speech under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. She took a breath, then delivered the words Jasmine had waited weeks to hear. The plaintiff's complaint is dismissed in full. The effect was immediate and visceral, a breath caught in someone's throat, then a ripple of disbelief, and then a swell. The public gallery, full of journalists, veterans, students, and citizens who had watched this trial unfold in real time, erupted into a standing ovation. It wasn't chaotic, it wasn't disrespectful, it was cathartic, like the pressure valve on a broken machine had finally been released. People clapped with reverence, not just celebration. Applause filled the chamber, growing louder as Jasmine stood quietly, letting it wash over her without raising a single hand. Her expression was calm, but her eyes glistened. Because beneath that silence she held inside was the memory of every moment she had been silenced. Langley sat motionless, lips tight, as if still trying to calculate the damage. Feldman had gone pale, eyes darting toward the exit, his legal pad now forgotten. The courtroom no longer belonged to them. Judge Ellis waited for the applause to quiet, then continued, her voice unwavering. In addition to this ruling, this court will be submitting a formal report to the Federal Judicial Conduct Council detailing the behavior and conduct of former presiding Judge James Boasberg. His prior suppression of evidence, hostile courtroom demeanor, and ethical violations constitute a breach of public trust. The judiciary cannot and will not protect its own when integrity is compromised. There it was again, that breathless hush, this time not out of shock, but of reckoning, a judge calling out another judge, not behind closed doors, but in the full light of day. Jasmine closed her folder gently. It wasn't just about her name being cleared. It was about the truth standing taller than power, if only for a moment. The price had been high. She'd been mocked, fined, threatened, and nearly railroaded by a system built to protect people like Langley and Boasberg. But now that same system, however bruised, had no choice but to admit what had been there all along. Outside, the country was already watching. CNN's live ticker flashed. Case dismissed, Crockett exonerated. MSNBC called her the woman who held the line. Fox News declared, Crockett shreds the narrative, Constitution wins. Hashtags were trending worldwide. Number Justice awakens, number Ellis over Boasberg, number Crockett crushes corruption, and number she did not blink. TikTok flooded with clips of her courtroom rebuttals. Law students shared annotated transcripts. Veterans sent tributes. Civil rights activists called her testimony a modern blueprint for legal resilience. But Jasmine wasn't watching the news. She was still standing at the defendant's table, surrounded by silence once again. This time, a silence that felt like peace. She looked at Judge Ellis and nodded respectfully. The judge returned it with something more than formality, something almost like admiration. Jasmine turned to leave, walking down the center aisle, where once eyes had judged her. Now they followed her like a hero stepping off the battlefield. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She walked quietly, almost humbly, carrying only the truth, and the proof that no amount of money, power, or manipulation could erase it. And as she reached the doors, someone in the crowd whispered what the entire country would soon repeat. She didn't just win, she changed the rules. The courtroom victory may have cleared her name, but Jasmine Crockett knew it was only the beginning. One corrupt judge had fallen, but the system that empowered him still stood. Beneath the applause, beneath the headlines, the real work was just starting, and Jasmine wasn't about to walk away while the wounds of others remained wide open. 2 weeks after the verdict, she stepped into a room she never thought she'd see from this side of history. Room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building, where the House Judiciary Committee held its most consequential hearings. The walls were lined with portraits of lawmakers long gone. The air was stale but heavy with precedent. Reporters packed every seat in the press box. Live feeds were rolling on 4 major networks. And in the center of it all sat Jasmine, alone behind a polished oak table, with a nameplate that now read Ms. Jasmine Crockett, Washington Liberty Alliance instead of defendant. The committee chair banged the gavel. This hearing will come to order. Jasmine adjusted the mic. Her opening statement was short, but lethal. I am not here as a lawyer. I am not here as an activist. I am here as a survivor of a system that tried to silence me for telling the truth. A stillness fell over the chamber. She launched into her story, not with emotion, but with clarity sharpened by experience. She spoke of being dragged through a trial over a political statement, of evidence blocked and dismissed, of being fined for defending herself. Then she pivoted swiftly and surgically to something larger. My case was public, she said, but the injustice isn't unique. For every one of me, there are 100 others who don't get a camera or a hashtag, just a verdict delivered by someone they never had a chance to question. Then she dropped the numbers. 22 documented instances in the past 5 years where federal judges failed to recuse themselves from cases involving financial or political conflicts of interest. 11 instances where formal complaints of judicial misconduct were quietly dismissed by internal review panels. Only 1 public censure. 0 removals. She named names, showed receipts, and she backed it up with copies of FOIA requests, legal analysis from independent scholars, and interviews with whistleblowers, all entered into the record. The room didn't gasp, it froze. And then came her final act, the unveiling of a proposed bill, co-authored with legal scholars, backed by civil liberties organizations, and now gaining bipartisan support on the Hill. Its formal name, the Judicial Ethics and Public Accountability Reform Act. But even the committee chair, a gray-haired veteran from Connecticut, called it what the headlines already had, the Jasmine Act. The proposed legislation was historic in scope, a mandatory judicial ethics disclosure database available to the public, an independent federal judicial oversight board composed of legal professionals, former judges, and citizen representatives, annual conflict of interest audits of all federal judges, a streamlined, transparent misconduct complaint system with investigatory power outside the judiciary itself, term limit recommendations for Article 3 judges pending constitutional review. This is not a punishment, Jasmine told the committee. It's a safeguard, because power without oversight is how people like James Boasberg become more dangerous than the criminals they sentence. A young congresswoman leaned into her mic. Ms. Crockett, are you suggesting that judicial corruption is widespread? Jasmine didn't blink. I'm saying we don't know, because we never bother to look. She wasn't angry, she wasn't theatrical, she was relentless. And the room listened, because the truth had already proven itself in open court. A few skeptical members tried to poke holes in her plan, citing budget constraints, judicial independence, and constitutional separation of powers. But Jasmine was ready. Judicial independence means freedom from political pressure, she said. It doesn't mean freedom from consequences. No one should sit on a federal bench with the power to ruin lives and zero accountability to the people they serve. By the time her testimony ended, the atmosphere in the chamber had shifted. What began as a procedural hearing had become a national moment. Outside the Capitol, Protesters held signs not of outrage, but of hope. Back the Jasmine Act. Accountability is patriotic. No more secret judges. News outlets flooded the airwaves. The Washington Post called it the most ambitious judicial reform package in 50 years. The New York Times featured a cover story titled, "How One Woman Took the Bench to Trial and Won." On social media, the movement exploded. Activists, legal professionals, students, and even former judges posted their support using the hashtags Your Jasmine Act Now and Restore Justice. But Jasmine didn't linger in the spotlight. After the hearing, she stepped out of the building, past cameras and questions, and whispered to an aide, "Let's get back to work." Because for her, this wasn't a victory lap. It was just the next case. And this time, the defendant wasn't a single judge. It was the system itself. And Jasmine Crockett was ready to prosecute. After Jasmine Crockett's explosive testimony on Capitol Hill, the political landscape across America felt like it had been hit by a quake. Word spread quickly that her proposed Jasmine Act, aimed at overhauling judicial oversight, wasn't just a one-off dream. In Washington, D.C., officials began implementing the earliest provisions of the new model, which featured mandatory ethical disclosures, public complaint databases, and real-time audits of judges' potential conflicts of interest. At first, many observers scoffed, claiming local jurisdictions would never mirror the bold steps taken in the nation's capital. But something unexpected happened. Citizens began demanding change, lining up at town halls and confronting their elected representatives, pressing them to adopt the same or similar reforms. It was no longer just about political grandstanding. It was a groundswell, a fierce wave of popular support from people who had finally glimpsed the possibility of genuine judicial accountability. Social media exploded with grassroots movements like Adopt the DC model and Reform is Patriotic, led by law students, community activists, and even a few high-profile judges who'd grown weary of protecting corrupt peers. The pressure mounted quickly, and state legislators across the country realized they could no longer ignore the public's outcry. By the end of that month, the conversation had moved beyond DC's immediate sphere, because states from coast to coast were waking up to a new reality. Illinois was among the first to step up, galvanizing bipartisan support for what local newspapers called the strongest judicial ethics overhaul in a generation. Lawmakers there introduced a sweeping bill resembling the DC framework, requiring every judge to submit annual financial disclosures on all personal and family-held assets. Gone were the days of burying investments in obscure trust funds or masking potential conflicts of interest through complicated corporate shells. In Chicago, a city riddled with historical political scandals, this sudden transparency felt downright radical. Yet the public response was overwhelmingly supportive, as citizens packed county auditoriums to voice their backing for a system that would hold judges to the same standards as any public servant. The debates on the State House floor reached a fever pitch when an investigative journalist unveiled data linking a long-serving judge to real estate deals underwritten by city contractors. Activists rallied, demanding the immediate passage of the Integrity in Courts Act, which mirrored Jasmine's blueprint in almost every clause. Even skeptical politicians soon realized they could either adapt to the wave of reform or risk being swept away in the next election cycle. Meanwhile, in Arizona, political desert storms brewed over the possibility of adopting the new framework. Critics claimed it would create a judicial witch hunt, stoking paranoia and undermining the independence of the courts. However, supporters argued that without accountability, independence was meaningless, a shield for hidden corruption rather than a safeguard of impartial justice. In Phoenix, the governor organized a special commission to study the DC model. Included were retired judges, law professors, and even grassroots leaders who had once been dismissed as fringe activists. Their findings were damning. Over half of the complaints filed against Arizona judges in the last decade had been dismissed without a hearing, often due to vague standards or conflicts of interest among the reviewers themselves. When the commission publicly endorsed a near-carbon copy of the Jasmine Act, it caught many career politicians by surprise. But the ground had shifted. Constituents were more informed and engaged than ever, thanks to the steady drumbeat of national coverage triggered by Jasmine's infamous showdown with Boasberg. By the time a crowd of 5,000 gathered outside the state capitol, brandishing signs that read, "Justice above all" and "Let Arizona lead," the legislature knew the momentum was unstoppable. Over on the East Coast, Maryland took a distinctly grassroots approach to implementing similar measures. County councils began sponsoring open forums where residents could voice grievances about their experiences in family court, traffic court, and small claims court. A cascade of stories emerged revealing how often decisions were influenced by intangible, sometimes personal factors. A group of volunteers collaborated with local media outlets to map out repeated patterns of bias across different judges, something previously impossible without a formal structure for data collection. As that map circulated online, viral hashtags like #OneNation9 mapped the corruption and judges on notice sprang up, rattling a judiciary unused to such intense scrutiny. In a particularly dramatic session at the Baltimore City Council, a woman tearfully described how her case had been dismissed by a judge who attended the same golf club as her ex-business partner. That story, broadcast live, ignited a wave of public outrage so forceful that lawmakers were practically compelled to endorse a measure resembling D.C.'s mandatory disclosure rules. In a narrow but decisive vote, the measure passed, setting the stage for a statewide referendum that might well transform Maryland's judicial ethics framework forever. Kentucky, initially resistant to any reform that challenged local traditions, experienced perhaps the most unexpected pivot of all. Traditionalists in the state Senate had dismissed the D.C. model as too big city, scoffing at what they perceived to be bureaucratic red tape. But then came a scandal involving a circuit judge who allegedly received lucrative gifts from a private corrections company. Rumors flew about lavish dinners, weekends at a lakeside cabin, and hidden campaign donations. Reporters who'd previously ignored the realm of judicial oversight suddenly found themselves chasing a major story. Public trust, once taken for granted, began to plummet. Spurred by the humiliation, a group of young lawmakers decided enough was enough. They introduced a motion adopting key points from the Jasmine Act: annual financial disclosures, independent oversight bodies, and mandatory recusal if any direct or indirect conflict was found. Though older senators tried to downplay it, labeling the scandal an isolated incident, calls for their resignations began echoing through local radio talk shows. Under mounting pressure, Kentucky's Senate authorized a study committee to draft a final bill that mirrored D.C.'s reforms, with near unanimous votes in both chambers once the public learned the depth of the alleged corruption. Suddenly, what had seemed like an alien concept from a distant capital became the lifeline of Kentucky's battered judiciary. Tennessee, Colorado, Michigan, and even heavily conservative states like Wyoming soon followed suit, each adapting the D.C. model to local contexts. In many places, the catalyst was simple, undeniable logic. If the nation's capital, often mocked as a swamp of lobbying and partisanship, could clean up its judiciary, why couldn't they? Politicians found themselves hard-pressed to argue against transparency, especially once the storyline of a single woman, Jasmine Crockett, taking on a corrupt judge resonated in every corner of American media. Political strategy memos began circulating, advising candidates that standing against judicial reform was akin to career suicide. The momentum became a tidal wave, fed by nightly news segments that tracked each state's progress and criticized those dragging their feet. Newspapers carried daily editorials calling for a new era, quoting Jasmine's testimony about how power without scrutiny is a threat to democracy, no matter how you dress it up. Governors and attorneys general convened emergency sessions. Mayors held town halls. The public, once apathetic about procedural matters, now spoke the language of audits, disclosures, and independent oversight like it was part of the national DNA. In every state house implementing these reforms, there were tense debates and last-minute attempts at sabotage. Lobbyists representing big law firms or corporate interests tried to water down key provisions. Some judges pushed back, claiming they were being vilified for the sins of a few. But the wave of popular support always won out. People remembered Jasmine standing in that D.C. courthouse, overshadowed by power, yet refusing to bow. They recalled the moment Boasberg was led away in cuffs, a living reminder that no one was above scrutiny. The images of that day became the rallying cry. We can't let it stop here. Citizens demanded robust ethics codes, mandatory recusal rules, and third-party audits that would release findings straight to the public. From the largest metropolises to the smallest rural counties, a new philosophy took hold. The justice system belonged to them, not to a select group shielded by archaic traditions of secrecy. By the time the reforms were in various stages of passage across 15 states, journalists were already calling it the Jasmine Revolution. Scholars argued over whether the changes went too far or not far enough. Cable news anchors debated if states were merely riding a populist wave rather than implementing thoughtful, incremental policy. Through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained notably reserved. She didn't do many press tours or anchor interviews, preferring to let local leaders shape their own solutions. She publicly stated, "This was never about me. It's about giving everyday people the power to trust in the courts that judge them." And the people believed her. Opinion polls showed the highest confidence in judicial institutions in decades, a surge many attributed to the wave of new transparency and the ripple effects of her stand. That wave, stronger than any single scandal or political whim, continued to build. Long-standing judges began choosing early retirement over disclosing questionable financial ties. Newer judges discovered a sense of public duty they'd never felt before. Law schools adjusted their curricula to teach cases not just about legal theory, but about the ethical frameworks now sweeping through the states. And beyond all this, citizens finally felt they had a seat at the table where justice was served. They stood in line to file complaints, sure, but they also showed up to volunteer for oversight committees or to watch real-time data on judicial performance posted online. The entire system was transforming from the inside out, with Washington, D.C. as its unlikely beacon of change. As the reforms continued to unfold, the story of Jasmine Crockett and her improbable journey from beleaguered defendant to catalyst of nationwide reform became a parable of civic power. If one woman could crack the walls of a fortress built to protect the unaccountable, imagine what a nation, newly awakened, could do. And the states, once wary of D.C.'s influence, were now tearing down walls of secrecy in their own courthouses, unveiling a future where judges might finally fear no one except the people to whom they answered. Jasmine Crockett's return to Yale Law felt like something out of a political thriller rather than a mere speaking engagement. She arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the centuries-old Gothic spires casting long shadows across the courtyard, where students lined up in droves to catch a glimpse of the woman who had single-handedly toppled a corrupt judge. Administrators had scrambled to find a venue big enough, ultimately deciding on the largest lecture hall, which filled to capacity an hour before the event. Outside, more students braved the chill, hoping the live feed from inside would do justice to the electricity buzzing through campus. When Jasmine finally appeared at the front of that immense hall, every whispered conversation died away, replaced by hushed anticipation. She wore a simple dark suit, no frills, no flashy jewelry, yet her mere presence carried the authority of a movement that had gripped the nation. As she scanned the room, she caught sight of professors who had once taught her torts and constitutional law, now looking at her with a mix of pride and awe. Meanwhile, on the balcony level, a group of visiting alumni in tailored suits observed intently, as if witnessing the birth of a modern legal icon. And behind them, unnoticed by many, were half a dozen news cameras perched like silent sentinels, ready to broadcast her words to a country still caught in the fever of reform. When Jasmine finally spoke, her voice carried the calm conviction of someone who had faced the system at its worst and lived to tell the tale. "I didn't destroy the system," she said quietly, pausing just long enough to let the words land. "I merely exposed those who exploited it." A murmur rippled through the crowd like distant thunder. Cameras zoomed in on her face, searching for any hint of nerves, but her expression remained focused, more teacher than politician, more champion than celebrity. She detailed her journey from an eager Yale law student, passionate about civil rights, to a defendant persecuted by a judge's personal vendetta. Each sentence reverberated with the authenticity of a person who had learned, through blood and heartbreak, that justice was often less about lofty ideals and more about everyday perseverance. She acknowledged the heartbreak of countless defendants across the country whose valid complaints had been dismissed by biases hidden behind a robe. Then she segued into the reforms blossoming nationwide. The new transparency measures, the ethics committees, the rash of state legislatures adopting frameworks inspired by her experiences. At that point, a dozen students stood in the back, leaning forward as though her words were the oxygen they'd been waiting to breathe. Her keynote address concluded with a pointed reminder. This country's greatest strength isn't our laws. It's our willingness to change them when they fail us. As the room erupted into applause, Jasmine set aside the podium to answer questions. Eager hands shot up from every corner. Bright-eyed 1Ls fresh out of undergrad, jaded 3Ls who had already seen the legal system's cracks, and even visiting professors who spent their careers researching the intersection of law and ethics. One student hesitated, then asked about the fear of backlash. Did Jasmine ever worry about angering the wrong people, especially with so many powerful interests lurking in the shadows? Her answer was quick, laced with humility, but also steel. I fear a world where justice is sold to the highest bidder more than I fear any backlash. The applause came again, bolder this time. Then she opened up about the letters she'd been receiving, letters from former convicts who claimed they'd been railroaded by biased judges, from single parents stuck in custody battles where backroom friendships tilted the scales, from law students in small towns who felt stifled by the old guard. Each letter, she explained, reminded her that her fight was never just personal. It was the tip of an iceberg holding millions of unheard stories. That notion, she said, propelled her forward more than any official recognition ever could. In the weeks following her talk, Yale's campus was abuzz with an energy rarely seen, and Jasmine became something of a mythic figure among the law students. They discussed her speech in the cafeteria, dissected her arguments in study groups, and even formed a new student organization called Defenders of Judicial Integrity, with membership tripling in its first month. Meanwhile, outside the ivy-covered walls, news outlets ran story after story about the letters pouring in from across the nation. Victims who believed they'd been wrongly convicted wrote about how Jasmine's story gave them hope that the system could be forced to listen. Law firms received calls from prospective clients citing her case as evidence that, finally, judges would have to think twice before shutting them down. Some conservative commentators accused her of grandstanding, but the tide of public opinion was overwhelmingly in her favor. In one unforgettable editorial, a prominent columnist wrote, "In an age of cynicism, Jasmine Crockett has done the unthinkable. She's restored our belief that law can be a sword for truth rather than a shield for corruption." At night, in dorm rooms and apartments, young law students replayed her talk, some in awe, others with tears of inspiration, determined to follow in her footsteps and carry the torch of reform wherever the law had grown dark. Before long, prominent legal scholars began comparing her to Clarence Darrow, whose fiery courtroom style once championed the powerless, and to Sandra Day O'Connor, the trailblazing Supreme Court justice, who forged her own path through a male-dominated judiciary. Jasmine shied away from such lofty parallels, often saying, "I'm not an icon, I'm just someone who refused to be quiet." Still, the comparison stuck, and the label of civil rights hero became harder to dodge. Visiting campuses across the country, she encountered tearful parents grateful for her stand, ex-inmates who found renewed faith in the possibility of appeals, and even hardened prosecutors who privately admitted they'd started examining their own biases. At Yale, she was invited to teach a short seminar on judicial ethics, a packed event where seats filled within minutes. Professors who once critiqued her first-year moot court technique now praised her real-world mastery of the law's most crucial test, defending truth against power. And every day more letters arrived, some from halfway around the globe, praising her for taking on the Goliath of judicial corruption and proving that one voice, when persistent, could reshape an entire system. In the end, when asked if she ever felt overwhelmed by the avalanche of expectation, Jasmine would only smile and recall the darkest moment of her trial, the moment she realized that the courts weren't only about black-robed figures and dusty books, they were about people's lives, their families, their futures. I'm not destroying the system," she repeated, echoing the line that had turned her talk at Yale into a national rallying cry. "I'm just refusing to let anyone hide behind it." And for a new generation of lawyers, activists, and ordinary citizens, That was the kind of defiance they'd been waiting to see. An unstoppable force that made the impossible feel suddenly, wonderfully possible. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.